Hi, everyone, and welcome to another screencast for our Western Civ course this semester. Today I wanted to take a brief look at the history of ancient Rome. I want to look at some of its early history. I want to take a look at some of the political history, the struggle of the orders, a little bit at Roman religion, and maybe if we have time, we'll take a look briefly at the history of the Roman family. Ancient Rome, of course, is an important foundation civilization to the West. Its influence is far and wide in Western civilization, and even in our own country as well. So it's important that we take a look at this. When historians look at the history of ancient Rome, one of the big overarching questions that they usually wrestle with is how it was that this small Italian city-state tucked out in the middle of the Mediterranean was able to become one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world. So I'd like to take a look at that question a little bit and maybe explore it in some regard here. I want to start off by just mentioning a couple of the important foundation myths that are connected with this civilization. All these ancient civilizations have foundation myths, whether it's the ancient Greeks or the Sumerians or the Babylonians or the Egyptians. And the Romans, of course, have some wonderful foundation myths as well. One of the most important ones are recorded for us by the Roman author Livy, who was writing kind of at the early part of the Roman Empire. So he's writing much, much later than when some of these stories are taking place. But he's recounting for us some of the important ancient myths about the founding of Rome and also the founding of the Republic. One of his stories is connected to these founding brothers, Romulus and Remus, that go back to the 8th century BC. And the story has it that these two children were found floating on the Tiber River in a basket. They were rescued and raised by a she-wolf of all things. They turned out to be shepherd boys and one day had a big fight over where they should found their little city. And Romulus ended up killing Remus and founding his city on the Palatine Hill in the ancient city of Rome. And if you go to the Palatine Hill today, you can find some tourist stuff related to Romulus and Remus. But it's an interesting story, and I'd encourage you to read it when you have a chance. One of the other foundation myths comes later in 509 BC, also recorded by Livy, and that's the story of the rape of Lucretia that I'm asking you to read for this class. It's a very interesting story, and I'd like you to read this in connection with the story about the assassination of Julius Caesar, which of course happens much, much later. And I want you to just see if there are any connections between these two stories. So all of these civilizations have these foundation myths, and they're very, very interesting to take a look at. The study of Rome, of course, must at least focus a little bit on the geography of ancient Rome. And Rome is, as you know, is situated on the Tiber River, and it's around the central western part of the Italian peninsula along the coast of the Mediterranean. It became a very important strategic location and an important location for commerce and trade. So it really was a central area, and it kind of helps to explain a little bit why the city of Rome was as successful as it was in terms of its conquests. On the eastern part of the peninsula, there are a lot of mountains. And so the way Rome is situated on the Tiber River, it became an important crossing area where people could travel from the north, the Etruscan area, into the south in Campania, down around where Naples was. And Campania was kind of the West Palm Beach of the ancient world, and anybody who was anybody went down to the south to have a nice retirement community and whatnot. But going through the city of Rome, it provided a place where you could cross the Tiber River, and so it became a really important highway, if you will, between the north and the south. So let me just say a few things about the Etruscans. The Etruscans were northern Italian people who migrated into central Italy beginning around the 7th century BC, and they created a number of permanent hilltop settlements and dominated Italy for centuries, really. Of course, they were a Hellenized group, and at one point they conquered the city of Rome and made it an important cultural center in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. Of course, they conquered the city of Rome because it was an important coastal city that allowed you to travel from the north to the south. But the Etruscans held Rome for about 100 years. They paved the streets, they built a wall. The Romans adopted Etruscan dress. And by the time the last Etruscan king was thrown out in 509 BC, Rome had become a pretty powerful city-state. So they're a really important influence on the early history of Rome. Another great cultural influence on Italy was Greece, of course. And Greece had colonized much of southern Italy and Sicily. It was called the Magna Graecia, or the Greater Greece. And so it's pretty easy to see how Italy and the Romans would be influenced by Greek civilization. They were influenced by the Greeks, but not always enamored by the Greeks, and that's an important point to keep in mind. So in 509 BC, the Romans supposedly drove out the last of the Etruscan kings, and they established a republican form of government. And the republican form of government lasted until 27 BC. Now, from a political standpoint, I'd like to mention here the struggle of the orders. The struggle of the orders was probably the most important development in terms of the Republican Constitution. And this struggle was about creating political equality between a group of people called the patricians, these were aristocrats, and the plebeians, who were basically everybody else. In 509 BC, at the beginning of the Republic, only the patricians could hold office. But what happens during the next 200 years or so is that the patricians brought the plebeians into a certain level of political equality. So that's the really important point, that over this course of 200 years, the patricians were able to bring the plebeians into a certain level of political equality. Now, the catalyst for this change really involved the military. There's one thing that we could say about the Romans: they were almost always at war. And this is how they, of course, created their empire. But with a limited number of aristocratic patricians, the plebeians, as you might imagine, were needed to fight in the Roman legions. So the plebeians had a couple of very important weapons that helped them to create this political equality. One, in fact, was the threat of secession. And they used this weapon pretty well on several occasions. They simply threatened to move out of the city. It was a peaceful threat, but it was a very real threat nonetheless. And you can imagine these patricians, these aristocratic patricians, being threatened with the mass exodus of all of these plebeians, and these patricians being left there to defend themselves against all these potential invaders. It would have been a really scary sort of thing for these patricians with their fancy schmancy togas and whatnot. And so this threat of succession really worked well to help gain that political equality. The other thing is that the plebeians took the initiative to elect a representative called a tribune. And this tribune had the right of veto in the Roman political system. And so the plebeians were able to kind of shove this office of the tribune into the political system. And again, it worked. So by around 287 BC or so, the patrician families, while they maintained aristocratic status, they legally shared power with the plebeian class of people. Now, on balance, of course, the rich always do better than the poor, so, we have to keep that in mind as well. But the point here, and I think this is the real takeaway from this struggle of the orders, the point here is that the Senate saw the wisdom of unity over and against disunity. I want to make sure that's clear, that at the end of the day, whatever the specifics were in this struggle, the Senate, the governing body of the Romans, saw the wisdom of maintaining unity over and against disunity. In other words, what they had discovered, and it's something that is passed down to us as well, class warfare ultimately harms and doesn't help the state. And think about that in terms of a modern context, in terms of the struggles that we face in today's world. This is an important point that we learned from the Romans. Class warfare ultimately harms the state and doesn't necessarily help it. Now, some of the principles of Republican government I wanted to mention as well. It's important that we know something about Roman Republican government, because our own government here in the U.S. is based largely on Roman law and Roman government. The first thing I'd mention here is that the Republican Constitution was not something that was written down, unlike our Constitution here in the United States. In a sense, the Republican Constitution was like the British Constitution. It was simply Roman custom. It was the Roman way. The Constitution was the Roman way of doing things, the customary, traditional ways of operating. Now, the Romans constantly compared themselves to the Greeks. And while they thought that they were inferior to the Greeks in some ways, particularly in terms of maybe intellectually, maybe in terms of art or philosophy, they also realized that they were much better than the Greeks in terms of avoiding internal strife. The Roman Republic was adaptive. It could change easily to meet needs, and they would change the government without a whole lot of strife. In Greece, of course, this was something that was impossible, and I think it helps to explain why the Romans could go from a small city-state to an empire. They knew how to adapt. They knew how to adapt to meet the needs of a growing empire in a way that the Greeks never did. Although the Constitution wasn't written down, you can pick out a couple of important principles about their Constitution. The main principle of their government was that they did not want to be ruled by a king. They accomplished this really in two ways. First of all, every office was filled by election of short terms, that is 1 year. And the interesting thing was that at the end of this year, these officers were answerable for what they did, something that I wish our own political system occasionally had. Every office was also held by two people who could negate each other if necessary. And so by having at least two people who could veto one another, this meant that no one of them could become king. So one of the big principles of this system of government was they didn't want any kings. And the point here in all of this government system was to move things as slowly as possible. Remember, this was a government that was based on tradition. And there were many ways that you could bring the state to a halt. Tribunes could veto it. Any one of the officers could negate another officer and stop it. The gods could stop it. Of course, they only did business when the gods were favorable to their actions. And if the gods were unfavorable to their actions, they would halt those actions. So the whole idea is to kind of create a certain sense of gridlock in this government to keep things from moving too fast. And again, I'd like us to think a little bit about this because we often hear people complaining all the time about government gridlock. And then the notion that we should put aside our differences and work towards solution. And while that's certainly an important thing to do, the Romans want to caution us here. They want to let us know that the the way things run in terms of our government should be based on our past tradition. And we should be nervous a little bit about always trying to find something new, the new ideas that are out there. That the notion of gridlock is actually helps us to keep any one person or any single group of people from doing things that are potentially harmful to the overall functioning of the state. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, and maybe that's something that we can discuss later on. Now, let me mention something about the structure of Roman government. We see a number of these principles in the structure of the Roman government and how this structure is laid out. The two highest positions were the consuls, and these positions served in office for 1 year. They had the right of imperium. They could command the army. Their symbol was a fasces, which was a bundle of rocks and axes. These people essentially had the right to kill someone, okay? So they had that kind of authority. Each consul could veto the other, but remember, they're only in office for a year. In a military crisis, they could choose someone that they called a dictator for 6 months, and he could have full imperium, full command of the army for 6 months to deal with any sort of military strife of some sort. But I like this notion of always having two people, one being able to veto the other. It's an interesting concept. The praetors were people who were responsible to execute justice. They also had the right of imperium. There were tribunes who protected the plebs. I mentioned them earlier. There were quaestors who handled finances, and so on and so forth. There were censors who had the authority and power to take away citizenship. They measured your citizenship by wealth. And then once you had served in any of these upper offices, you could join the Senate. And the Senate had around 300 members who were former consuls, praetors. They served for life. They decided on policy. They decided on matters of state and other such matters that the state was facing. And the Senate formed the center of stability for the Republic. The Senate, of course, comes from senatus in Latin, or old guys. So these are the old people. And again, it highlights that notion of tradition and the Roman way being the way that we govern ourselves. Again, this is something that I think we need to maybe chat about a little bit, or talk about a bit, and how that maybe is somewhat different from the way that we understand government and the way that we understand our civilization today. In other words, what I'm mentioning here is that in our day and age, we tend to always highlight that which is new and that which is young. The ancient Romans tended to highlight what was old and what was traditional. And maybe that explains why their empire was able to last as long as it did. I don't know, but it's certainly something to think about. Now, let me mention a few things about Roman religion. Probably the most important thing that I'd say here is that there is no notion of the separation of church and state that we see so prominent in our modern era. The church and state were intimately connected, as they were really in all ancient civilizations. So religion was a matter of the state. And they believed that they were in an agreement or in a covenant with the gods. And that covenant was that if the Romans connect their side of the deal, the gods would provide stability for their state. And this is common throughout many ancient civilizations. We saw this with regard to the Hebrews. Their imperial success, they believed, was a direct result of having that favor with the gods, not unlike the ancient Hebrews. And what the Roman gods wanted were sacrifices. Each consul would promise to sacrifice a bull, a ram, a boar for Jupiter. And they had this treaty that was known as the Pax Deorum, or the peace of the gods. And if the Romans followed the religious rules, and they were pretty stringent, they would have peace. So proper ritual was something that was really important for the ancient Romans. And the magistrates consulted the gods by looking at auspices or omens or all sorts of things in order to try to figure out the will of the gods. They would look at the flight of birds. They would look at livers, things like that, to sort of determine what it was that the gods wanted, whether or not they were favorable to the actions that the Senate was planning. You remember this was something similar with the ancient Greeks who went to the Oracle of Delphi to often determine what the Greek gods wanted. And these were sometimes very personal matters, and sometimes these were matters of the state. So the important takeaway here is Roman religion was very, very important to the civilization. And although this was a polytheistic religion, this was something that the Romans took very seriously, both at the state level and at the personal level. This was not something like what we see today, which is this notion of separation of church and state. Now, let me just mention something else about the ancient Romans, and that was the importance of family. The Roman family, of course, was influenced by religion as well. And just as there was a hierarchy among the gods, there was also a hierarchy in the family. Now, the notion of family, the notion of patres, I mentioned earlier with regard to the struggle of the orders, the patricians, comes from the word patres. And the idea here is that the male elder is the one in charge of the family, the so-called pater familias. The male represented wisdom for the Romans. The term Senate, after all, refers to old men. So this is definitely a patriarchal type of family structure here. I want to make sure that we're clear on that. And this really was, if you will, a kind of father knows best society. I don't know if you catch that reference, but Father Knows Best was a sitcom back in the 50s. And with a very strong central figure of the father. This was a system the ancient Romans was governed by the family and by a strong fatherly presence within the family. The father represented tradition, the father represented duty. And in a sense, the family was intended to be a kind of microcosm of the state. It was holy, if you will. And as such, the state could not simply hurt the sanctity of the family without also sowing seeds of its own destruction. So again, this is very different from the Greeks, who thought that families served the state. And Plato's Republic here is a very good example of this, that family served the state. For the Romans, the state was modeled after the family. The state served the family. And patriotism, in a real sense, was simply a form of manliness. It was about honor. An example of this comes from Livy, the Roman historian who was writing at the time of Augustus. I mentioned him earlier. And he talks about a guy named Muscius, and who wants to defeat the Etruscans, and he comes up with the idea of climbing over a wall and sneaking into the Etruscan camp and killing his commander. He does this, he carries out this deed, but he ends up killing the commander's secretary instead. And he's brought before the officers, and I just want to read you here what he says, because it kind of illustrates this importance of the Roman family and the importance of the pater familias in this sense. He says, "I am a citizen of Rome. Men call me Gaius Muscius. As an enemy, I wish to kill an enemy, and I have as much courage to meet death as I had to inflict it. It is the Roman nature to act bravely and to suffer bravely. I am not alone in having made this resolve against you. Behind me, there's a long list of those who aspire to the same distinction. If then it's your pleasure, Make up your mind for a struggle in which you will every hour have to fight for your life and find an armed foe on the threshold of your royal tent. This is the war which we, the youth of Rome, declare against you. And so you get in something like this notion of patriotism and manliness and honor that was something that was so characteristic of the ancient Romans, particularly as it related to the male head of households. So the Roman family was something that was truly centered on the paterfamilias, and I want to make sure that that's clear to everybody. So what's our takeaway from the Romans? Well, the Republic lasts, again, from 509 BC until the time of Caesar Augustus. Perhaps you could put the end of the Republic at the death of Julius Caesar, but what we can take away from these folks is pretty interesting, especially in terms of their success. You have to remember, of course, that the Greeks are always in the background here. But at one level, one of our takeaways, I think, from the ancient Romans is this notion of respect for elders. The notion of wisdom and honor versus the Greek ideals of inexperienced youth. Okay? So respect for the elders is something that we can, I think, take away from these ancient Romans. These things might explain why it was that the Romans were as successful as they were. Wisdom and honor versus the Greek ideals of inexperienced youth. Another takeaway that we can have here is that the Romans did not want to have kings. Government, the point here is that government must have checks and balances. And that really is something that has come down to us in the West. It's taken us a long time to sort of figure this out. But in terms of our own civilization here in the United States, that's certainly an important component to our own government system. Government needs to have checks and balances. And the other thing I want to mention here, and this is perhaps not very politically correct, but that's the importance of the father and the importance of the family. For the Romans, the importance of father and the importance of family was absolutely at its highest. And this, again, may help to explain why Rome ultimately collapsed. And that is the collapse of the family that you see in the imperial period. The Republic placed a great importance on the father and also on the family. And the importance of tradition. This is, again, something that might rub us the wrong way as Americans. As Americans, we tend not to like this influence of tradition over us. But the importance of tradition rather than the pure democracy of the ancient Greeks. Okay? Again, the Greeks here in the backdrop. Notice, this is not just about the people. The Greeks, of course, had this notion of direct democracy, okay? But for the Romans, it was the Senate, the Roman Senate, and the people, okay? So that's what this SPQR stands for in this image, Senatus Populusque Romani, the Roman Senate and the people. It's not just about the people or the Senate. It's both. And the brilliance of the Roman Republic is that it combines the best of monarchy, the best of aristocracy, and the best of democracy. This is why the American founding fathers, if you will, spent so much time studying the ancient Romans, because that's the system that they built this on. Here's what Polybius says about this, writing around 120 BC or so. I'm going to give you a quote here, and I want you to just think about this for a second because it's a really important point. Here's what Polybius says. He says, "A state in which the mass of citizens is free to do whatever it pleases or takes into its head is not a democracy, but where it is both traditional and customary to reverence the gods, care for our parents, respect our elders, obey the laws, and in such a community to ensure that the will of the majority prevails. This situation it is proper to describe as a democracy. I want to state that again because it's really important. A state in which the mass of citizens is free to do whatever it pleases or takes into its head is not a democracy, but where it's both traditional and customary to reverence the gods, to care for our parents, to respect our elders, to obey the laws, and in such a community to ensure that the will of the majority prevails. This situation it's proper to describe as a democracy. This republic survives for 500 years or so, from 509 BC until the turn of the millennium. And this is the republic from which our own founding fathers drew inspiration. So I think some of these principles really do help to explain why the Roman system of government, why the Roman Republic, why the Roman Empire lasted for as long as it did. Ultimately, of course, it collapsed, but it had a tremendous successful run, as I mentioned before. So I hope this little screencast on the ancient Romans was helpful. Please be sure to comment on any of this online in our discussion groups. And if you have any other points to add from the readings or from the primary sources, let's be sure to talk about those online as well. All right, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you soon.